topic that we don't talk about a lot with K-State Research and Extension, specifically in fertilizing forages, but I know that in Pottawatomie County and a lot of other counties in our state, forages are big business and a really important aspect of caring and providing for livestock. So just to go ahead and introduce myself this evening, my name is Shannon Blocker. I am the Pottawatomie County Agriculture Extension Agent, and I've been in this role since 2017. I have actually been a county extension agent for agriculture and natural resources for a total of 18.5 years. So I have quite a bit of experience in this area, as well as while working in this position as an agent, I obtained my master's degree in agronomy, focusing on soil fertility. So this is something that's kind of near and dear to my heart, and something that I think that I can help those that want to know more about fertilizing forages to have an opportunity to do that. So this is the flyer, or the little screenshot of the presentations that I have done in regards to soil fertility and fertilizer. So last Thursday was our Fertilizer Basics 1, and if there's something tonight that you don't quite understand, feel free to ask, but also this video, which is a YouTube video now, as I am recording tonight, as well as I will the other meetings as well, they are posted on our Pottawatomie County Extension website. So that is listed right here. So you can find it under Hot Topics if you would like to catch up on what was shared last week. And then next week, we are looking forward to talking about advanced nutrient management. So we'll talk about some very specific things that are a little bit higher level for those that may be interested. I really hope that I will get a good list of topics to cover, as you know, ultimately we could go on for hours and hours, if not semesters and semesters on this topic if we wanted to. So tonight, I'm going to start off by acknowledging that Kansas State University, which is my employer, is an affirmative action and equal opportunity employer and provider. So this is our "And Justice for All" flyer that is in our meeting rooms and in our office. All right, so tonight I'm talking about fertilizing forages. So we'll just go ahead and get started as we get going here. So the topics that I am planning to cover tonight, but can also add or subtract some things based on some of the feedback that you might want to share with me, is to talk about the fertilizer needs of plants that we grow for grazing, silage, hay, but basically anything that we raise to feed to livestock of any species or type. That can handle it. So, you know, whether that be things for horses, cattle, sheep, goats, etc. If it is a forage and we feed it to livestock, then that's hopefully what we'll be discussing, or I'm open for questions regarding tonight. And so the first thing that we're going to talk about is all the different forage species. And I won't necessarily specifically cover each one tonight. Particularly, I'm going to teach you some of the techniques that we use with K-State Research and Extension to help kind of tweak our fertilizer recommendations, as well as our management types of decisions. But I do want to kind of highlight that there's a huge variety of things that can be raised for forage in Pottawatomie County and in Kansas. The next, we'll talk about the impact of harvest method on soil fertility, or on the fertility of the forages. And really, that's probably one of, if not the very most important thing about understanding how forages respond and react to fertilization. And then forage quality impacts will be discussed a little bit, at least anyway, and I'll kind of show you some things in regards to that. Weed concerns. There's one particular weed concern that I really want to highlight tonight, but if you have other questions related to that, I will try to deal with them. I do want to focus on those that are impacted by soil fertility, of course, though. And then a couple forage toxicities or problems, diseases are also related to fertility. So we'll be grabbing those as well this evening. So, all right. So we'll start off with the wide range of forage species that are grown right here in the state of Kansas and northeast Kansas and Pottawatomie County. And you can see that there is definitely a wide variety of things. And this is not an all-inclusive, as you could easily find out. But these are probably the ones that I would describe as the major or main. Now, you may look down here at warm season and see Bermuda grass. Not really a Pottawatomie County warm season choice for us. The survivability is not good here, but in southeast Kansas in particular, a lot of Bermuda grass is grown for forage. So, but I importantly group these into two groups known as the cool season forages and the warm season forages. And there are some crossovers between the different ones, but how we manage these forages and especially deal with their fertility is strongly impacted by the whether it is a cool season crop or a warm season crop. Not only does the fertilization rates kind of match whether they're cool season or warm season, but obviously fertilization timing is more attributed to what time of year do they grow. So that's really what it means. The major cool season species that we are going to kind of talk about the most are going to be brome as number one. I do have some data for tall fescue, almost a dirty word in the Flint Hills, but it is a valuable forage crop in different parts of the state and has some advantages here sometimes as well, depending on land use and decisions regarding that. I have a little bit of information about alfalfa. I can definitely answer more questions or talk more about that one. But I want to talk about basically these here, these legumes, small grain cereals, and brassicas. All of those fit into the definition of a cover crop. In many cases, that's probably the primary interest that we may have in them. But there are cases where we intentionally graze wheat and we still want to grow the wheat crop, you know, out or grow it to seed. So there are definitely cases where we're trying to grow these either exclusively or in combination with different species. For example, in southeast Kansas, one common combination is to put tall fescue with some red clover. But anyway, we can go there. And then I'll briefly kind of mention crop residues. And again, open to more questions if you have them. Warm season things that we're going to talk about. Well, my personal favorite is always going to be native grass. I grew up in the tall grass prairie in the Flint Hills, and I now live here too again. So, you know, that's a very important part of our forage and quite honestly, the ag economics of the state of Kansas. But there are some other species that we need to keep in mind. One of the more newer, or at least to be thought of as a true forage, is crabgrass. So I'll talk briefly about that and definitely am happy to answer questions. Crabgrass is technically an annual, so it could go down here, but the reason I kept it separate is that we tend to manage it more like a perennial by letting it go to seed and keep it going like that. Again, Bermuda grass, not so important in Pottawatomie County. Eastern gamma grass is actually a particular species of our native grass prairie that does really well and is very, very palatable and very tasty to livestock. In particular, if you are grazing a pasture that has Eastern gamma grass, you usually don't see it because it is honestly grazed out a lot of times. It's very highly coveted, but sometimes we manage it for hay, and sometimes we, get surprised by it. The conditions are just right, and the Eastern gamma puts up its head, and we need to know that that's not a weed. So corn and sorghum silage, of course, is important, as well as all the summer annual forages like Sudan grass, pearl millet, foxtail millet, your sorghum Sudan grass hybrids, etc. So, all right. So I decided this is where I was going to start, and to talk about harvest method and the impacts. And I guess this is what I'm going to charge you guys to maybe even possibly unmute yourself if you have something to say, or to jump in and share your thoughts in this. But right now I have up here nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, let's see, what is this one? Magnesium, sulfur, and zinc uptake by the crop known as corn. And there's a really important reason why I chose corn. As I'm sure most of you can figure out, corn is grown as a forage crop, and corn is grown as a grain crop. And I thought that would be really helpful to kind of talk about harvest method and how that makes a huge difference in how you need to plan your fertility and your fertilizer applications. So the first thing that we can look at is nitrogen right here. And my first question for you is about how much nitrogen is in the grain or the seed as far as a percentage amount. I don't really care so much about kilograms because that's, again, kind of a scientific unit. But what does it look like here? Maybe 60% maybe of the total uptake is in the grain? Yep, okay, good. So that means that the other parts that are out there, the tassel, the stalk, the leaf blades, make up somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 45% of the nitrogen uptake. And that becomes more important when we talk about nutrients that are immobile in the soil or do not move very much. Nitrogen, as I'm sure many of you know, is mobile in the soil, and rarely can we depend on a nitrogen application that we make this year to last until next year if we over applied it, for example. But it is kind of important that most of that nitrogen is in the grain, but we do have some that is in about 40–45% that is in the other parts of the corn. Phosphorus, it really goes to town, doesn't it, right? And if we allow the grain production to happen, I mean, we're talking about the seed containing, what is that? That's approximately 75% or so of the phosphorus that's taken up by the plant, okay? But there's a 25% that is the other parts as well. Very, very different when we look at potassium. If you'll notice here, the grain itself is only maybe 30–35%, and the other parts are the majority here, somewhere in the 70 or so % range. And I'm not as worried about magnesium, zinc, and sulfur, but what could that tell you about the harvest method? So let's pretend that you have a brome field. Or no, we're going to use corn. We're going to say you have a field of corn and you decided to, instead of growing it out for grain, you were going to put it in your silo. What does that mean as far as the removal of the big three, the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium? Anybody have anything they want to share?
You're removing a lot more phosphorus and potassium when you harvest it for silage.
Absolutely, you absolutely do, because if you're raising it for the grain, you're only going to take this portion of the total phosphorus and the total potassium, very small portion in comparison, of that away from the soil bank that's out there. But if you go ahead and silo it, are you going to have tassel in there? Yeah, probably so, or at least the cob and husk. You're going to have stalk, and you're going to have leaf blades. So all of those parts, all of this phosphorus that's taken up, and all of this potassium that's taken up, with a small amount left in the roots and in the stem that where you cut it off. But ultimately, you're taking all of this and you are physically removing it from the field. And that's really, really important to think about. And so the needs of a forage crop in terms of phosphorus and potassium can sometimes be forgotten. And a lot of times we get very, very low phosphorus soil tests for forages. And sometimes we can get some extreme situations in terms of potassium as well. So that's really where I wanted to go with how the harvest method impacts the decision and what you do there. But there's another thing to think about, and that's in our next slide, and that is in a hay or a silage system, you are taking those nutrients that were taken up by the plant. Sorry for these pictures. I thought this slide was cool, so I want to use it anyway, even though we got a Bos indicus over here. But anyway, you know, we take those and we physically remove them from the field where they are grown. Sometimes we might feed them back there, but for the most part, we don't. So if you have brome, or if you have silage, or anything that you're haying, even native grass that you have continually hayed, you are exporting or removing those nutrients from the situation, and they are not necessarily directly replaced. But if you're in a grazing system, on the other hand, and this is why, I'm going to say it right now, that's why cover crops that are grazed are excellent. Not only for their financial benefits to cover the costs of cover crops, but also because the nutrients, and this claims that 80 to 90% of the nutrients that the cow or the lamb or whatever species that it is that is out there eating it consumes ends up back into the soil system. And so there's a cycling, but the majority of things stay put. So that's why when you graze a cover crop, you may need a little bit of extra fertility, but you do not need a lot, because you are redepositing it and to that location. And so you can manage it differently. So, you know, I guess one analogy that you might use is native grass. If you have a native grass that you're grazing, you would never fertilize that for the most part. There's really very little or no need, and you might cause more problems than the benefits that you would have. However, if you have a field that has been hayed forever, you know, 50 plus years, whatever, maybe it's worth it to consider a small amount of fertilizer to replace those that are being removed by the hay operation. So that's important to consider as well. Let's see, there was something else on that I was going to kind of hit on, but essentially, oh, yeah, that's what it is. So in the grazing system, there's also some differences between different grazing systems, if you think about it too. So if you strip graze a cover crop field or something like that, and you section them off small amounts and then let them move to another place and section them off a small amount, that is helping to redistribute more evenly the nutrients that are coming out the backside of the cow or steers or whatever animal that you have out there. So you do have to think about where the animals are spending their time. That's one of the reasons that we talk about moving hay rings or possibly rolling out hay. You know, all of those decisions impact the distribution of the manure and the excrement across the area. So the more that you intensively manage it, the less nutrients that you will ultimately remove and not end up with highly intensive nutrition close to the water source or close to trees and shade, and basically none out in the middle. So those are things to think about as well. And then it's kind of a nice miracle sometimes when things work out, but just this week, basically just this week, I had a soil test come back for a producer that was wanting to soil test his established brome grass. When I shot out a yield goal, he said, sure, you know, and that's great. But you can see right here that we have kind of a tough situation. In other words, this situation is not going to allow this producer, even in the best case scenario, to achieve a 3-ton goal. That's a pretty hefty goal in terms of brome grass production anyway. But right now we have a phosphorus level of 5. That's quite low. You can see here by this chart that we would like to see that phosphorus level closer to 20. And then potassium. How many of you have ever seen potassium deficiency? Is anybody here from outside of Pottawatomie County? Maybe that's the question that I have for you guys, or at least this general vicinity, Northeast Kansas. Do I got any Southeast Kansas people or anything like that? Okay, I don't have anybody jumping. So usually potassium levels in Pottawatomie County, Northeast Kansas, quite honestly, Northwest Kansas, and even Southwest Kansas are extremely high. And ultimately, a lot of times our levels are what is being categorized here as above optimum naturally, and you have never, ever, ever added any potassium to the soil. But remember that when you are haying a piece of property and exclusively doing so, remember the grain or whatever on that corn only had a very small portion of the potassium. But if you continually remove all of the tissue, you are bringing that potassium level down. And so, you know, this field got to a 64 parts per million potassium when we would consider our critical level of potassium at 130. And it's not unheard of to have 270 or higher as far as potassium levels, and there's no negative consequences of that. So the harvest method caused this situation. Maybe not the phosphorus, but most definitely the potassium, because I think the vast majority of producers would say, wow, I've never seen anything like that. And it does happen. Silage is another common one that it will happen in. Growing up, when my grandfather was in charge of our ranch, we grew silage in the same field every year of my life, and probably every year of my dad's life, for example, partially because it was convenient and close to the pit silos. And so we continually grew a sterile sorghum silage actually in that location. And if we did not use that or add some potassium fertilizer, we would have ended up with potassium deficiency. And that has been found in places where you would never expect it, I guess is what I'm trying to say on that. So, all right. So, anybody have any questions or anything that they want to jump out and share before we kind of move on to past the harvest method stuff? All right. So the fertilization rates and the rate resources. The number one thing that I can tell you with almost no exclusions is that a soil test is going to be your very best friend. A soil test done every 3 to 5 years, and then keeping track of those records so that you can evaluate the trends over time is really the best thing that you can do as a forage producer. You can evaluate whether, yes, you know, I'm properly keeping my phosphorus and my potassium levels within range. And I can see that I could also see that I'm over applying some nutrients. And you can truly keep a good eye on that if you keep those records and you column the same things and you just see what happens over time. Now, do remember that on soil tests, the quality of the sample is everything. And if you did not attend last week, for a soil test to be worth its weight, I guess you might say, you really must have a minimum of 10 subsamples. So 10 sticks of a soil probe. And that is the pretty much bare bone minimum that you can to cover no matter how big your area is. And I like to encourage people to choose 20 because 20 will get you kind of in that 90% range for repeatability and reliability. So that if you took this a sample today and you took a sample tomorrow and you sent them to the lab, they would be really close to the same, within 10% or less. And it's to get to higher levels than that requires an enormous number of subsamples that no one wants to do. So I encourage you to really think about your soil testing and remember to try to cover the majority of the area by using a zigzag pattern, and you can learn more later. Last week, we talked about the soil test interpretations and fertilizer recommendations publication. So that publication is available here in the office or on the website, and it does cover forages as well, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Last week, we also talked a little bit about the fertilizer recommendation Excel program, and we're going to look at some things on it this evening. And then a couple other great sources for specifically for fertilizing forages there's a publication in the Forage Facts Notebook, which is a fairly old notebook, but a really great resource for those of you that are interested in growing forages. And it is available online as well, but there's one on fertilizing grasses, and it kind of walks through each classification and so forth and how that impacts things. And then there are species-specific production and utilization publications. For example, for the big ones. So there's going to be an alfalfa one, and then there's going to be a section in that one for fertility for sure. There's one for brome, there's one for fescue, and several other ones. But those are the big ones that I am 100% sure there is a specific book, I guess you might say, talking about raising those crops, and a section of that will talk about fertility as well. So those are the key things that we're going to kind of use to help us make some recommendations and make some decisions as far as fertilization. Last week, I also talked about the importance of pH. And why it's so important is that when you are in a somewhat ideal location situation where your pH is basically between 6 and 7 for basically all of the crops that we grow in this area, the proper amounts of the micronutrients and stuff are available in the soil. When you get outside of that range, either too high or especially too low, we start to have some major problems. Most of our forages, and especially things that would be classified as a grass, can handle a pH down to probably about 5.5 without too much trouble. But you can start to see where some of the things may become an issue. Magnesium might become an issue because that the availability is less there. Doubt that calcium will be an issue in Pottawatomie County or anywhere in Kansas, since we have a lot of limestone-based soils, but those things are there. You can also see that sulfur starts to decrease in its availability, as well as phosphorus. So those are things to think about. In addition, the one exception to our general rule of how you should sample for soil sampling of any crop, for that matter, is that most of the time you want to get a 0 to 6 inch sample. So you want to, basically just remove the residue off the surface or the, very top part of things, but not the soil itself, and stick the probe into the soil 6 inches deep and pull it out. That's one subsample. If you are only worried about pH and you are working with an established pasture or meadow, sometimes it's helpful to do a soil sample that's only 0 to 3 inches. But that sample is only good for pH. So you would have to submit another one that is a 0 to 6 in order to look at the other nutrients that you might be concerned with and that kind of thing. I will say that for the most part, though, we can do a nice job of giving you a lime recommendation if necessary, based even on that 6 inch sample. So it's not going to make or break it whether you do this 0 to 3, but if you are particularly worried about it, that can help us give a little bit more refined recommendation. And that's largely because lime is not mobile in the soil as well. So an established situation, you're not tilling it in or incorporating it into the soil really at all. So, okay. And I'm not going to go over this. I just wanted to point this out. Anytime you get a lime recommendation, step 3, the most important thing, in my opinion, is to consider the depth of incorporation. And in most cases with our forages, we're essentially not going to incorporate them. Or if we do, it's only before establishment, and really the deepest that we can effectively incorporate lime at this point without using a mold bore plow is to about 4 inches. And so as a result of that, we need to reduce our lime recommendations as compared to almost a 7 inch depth sample there. So that's something to keep in mind. Don't over apply lime, or you'll basically cause the opposite problem. And I guess the other thing that I can point out here is that alfalfa and clover and our legumes, they are going to use a target pH of 6.8. Everything else that you might grow is going to use a target pH of 6.0 right now. Even soybeans, but we're not talking about them today. So ultimately, knowing these things, and it's not wrong to have a target pH higher than the 6.0, it just may not cost flow quite as easily. But especially if you're incorporating it before establishment, then I might consider raising my target pH. All right, so the reason I included this one is this is an example of a very common situation that we would get for a brome grass soil sample that has honestly been well managed in terms of soil fertility. And so I just kind of wanted to show you what that might look like. you'll see that you would get soil test results back that would give you a soil pH. And if that is below 6.0 or 5.8 maybe even, then, well, you'll always get a buffer pH number, but then you might need to add some lime. Buffer pH is really important to know how much lime is needed. Soil pH only tells us, yes, lime's needed, no, it's not. Buffer pH tells us how reactive that soil is to lime and how much lime needs to be applied. So you could have very different soil pHs, but the same buffer pH and put the same amount of lime on in that case. Phosphorus, 12 parts per million is actually kind of right in that perfect range where you're going to receive a response to phosphorus. And so you would need to apply a little bit, but you are not in the levels where it's very, very high. And quite honestly, this is almost ideal in a brome grass type of situation. Potassium, you can see here, you know, that critical level is at 130. This one's at 189. It has been hayed for a long period of time, but it's still well above that 130 point. And it might very well be because this producer has been applying a small amount of potassium or potash as occasionally. But it just kind of depends on that. And you can see that the recommendations here of around 80 pounds per acre of nitrogen, and this is actual nutrients, not fertilizer. We'll talk about that in a second. Phosphorus at 20, and no potassium is recommended necessarily for this. I don't encourage people to over apply phosphorus. Number one, it's expensive. And number two, if you get your phosphorus levels to 50 or higher, sometimes that can increase the likelihood of runoff and issues with algae blooms and environmental concerns. So, you know, a phosphorus level between 20 and 30 is more than sufficient. So don't push them any higher than that. When we apply manure to a location, especially if that location is close to the lot where we collected it, often that's where we have to really manage our manure applications, because we get above 100 and really no more manure should be applied to that location at all because of the phosphorus levels. And this is important too, and this comes out on any soil test from K-State that is done for a brome grass or something like that. It will say if the grass is to be grown for hay, apply the nitrogen before the forage growth in the fall or spring. Graze forages, 60% should be applied before the forage growth, with the remaining 40% in the late summer, so like August, to support fall grazing. So if you are using a cool season crop like brome or fescue for grazing, you do need to split your application of a nitrogen fertilizer, or your quality will suffer from that. And this is just an example of that publication. I'm not going to talk about it too much, other than to say that if you go to the publication, you can find yield goals and soil test levels and find out how much is going to be recommended, which may be important if you are rotating, like in a silage type of situation, not so much for brome or fescue. It also has got a crop removal factor, and that's for comparative purposes really only. But essentially, each pound or each part per million of phosphorus equals 9 pounds of P2O5 out in the field. So if you want to raise your phosphorus levels, you have to over apply beyond the uptake of the plant, over apply phosphorus by 9 pounds to increase that level 1 part per million. and it's actually 18 when we start talking about 1 part per million in the potassium world. So that's just a little tip that can help you figure that out if you are starting to go backwards, or you can definitely talk to me and I would be happy to help you kind of keep track of your crop removal. If you weigh your forage, we can do a really good job of keeping track of that. Yes. Anybody have something? Okay. All right. So here's an example with sorghum silage. I just wanted to show a couple different crops, and you'll see the crop removal is listed here as well. Now, your silages are the only crop or something that is annual like this, are the only crops that are going to support what we refer to as a build maintenance program. I didn't screen capture that, but the idea behind a build maintenance program is to get your phosphorus levels up to between 20 and 30 parts per million, and your potassium levels between about 130 and say 160 or 150, somewhere in there. And at those levels, you can basically skip an application 1 year, or you shouldn't have to continually apply those nutrients. So that's kind of the idea behind that. But we don't do it with established things because, again, that phosphorus and potassium doesn't move well. And so you're putting it on the surface, but it's not getting down to the root system. In this situation, it moves more because of the tillage, or even just the fact that that soil is not made into basically turf or solid stand of grass. All right, so you may be wondering, where am I going to find all of these things? Well, first of all, you can always ask us, but the agronomy department has a web page, and at K-State, and under services, there's the soil testing lab. If you look at fertilizer recommendations, you can get this publication that I was showing right here. You can also get the Excel program that I'm getting ready to kind of show you guys to record or to kind of work with your recommendations as well. This is just the instructions on how to use it above that. So, all right. So this is a kind of a screen capture of the Excel program that was written clear back in 2003, but it still works well today. And I put in there an example of 4 different forages to kind of show you how this works, and we'll kind of see what the recommendations are for these crops are. And if you have something that you want me to spit out, please don't hesitate, because I can edit this live. I may have to drop it down into not presentation mode, but it can be edited live, and I would be happy to kind of let you see how that works as well. But you'll see in this case, we did the 6-inch depth for all of them. We are going to try to grow brome, new alfalfa or clover, silage, sorghum, and then I wrote Bermuda. But over here I had crabgrass. Why might I have I done that? Anybody have any guesses? Nope, no guesses. Okay. Don't all jump up at one time. All right, so one of the limitations of working with forages and soil fertility recommendations from anywhere, to be honest, is that not every single species out there has its own specific recommendations. So in general, we know that if it's a cool season grass, we're going to use the recommendations for brome or fescue or something like that. So if somebody really wanted to try to grow some, some orchard grass, for example, I would probably put brome as the intended crop so that I could get a result that would be close to the recommendations for that crop. In this case, we do not have specific recommendations for crabgrass, That's why I named it crabgrass. But Bermuda is a warm season crop and behaves in a fertility manner very similar to crabgrass. And so I am using my knowledge of knowing cool and warm seasons and what crops that we have a lot of data on to help me do a good job of getting phosphorus and potassium and even nitrogen recommendations out of this Excel sheet. So I put the results of these made up tests down here. I guess I wanted to point out here that the pH for the alfalfa is low. The pH for the silage is the same, but we will not have a silage nitrogen or a silage lime recommendation, okay? And the pH for the crabgrass is also low, and we should have one for that based on the fact that it's 5.8 or below. In the phosphorus world, you can see that most of these samples come back as slightly low or very low. The exception to that is going to be our silage field. And in this potassium world, everything's fine except for the silage. And we'll see that when we go to the next slide and look at the recommendations. Again, we're not going to be incorporating our lime, so the number we tend to use when we aren't doing that is 2. And we're not going to worry about the years to build because we're going to use sufficiency recommendations. All right, so for brome, you can see that if you had this kind of yield goal, your nitrogen recommendation is 80. Phosphorus, I believe this one was 12, so 25, and the potassium was plenty. You can see that, yes, the clover has a lime recommendation, and the Bermuda has a lime recommendation, but this silage sorghum does not. One of the things that happened here is because I said the previous crop was soybeans, it actually reduced the recommendation for nitrogen. This is a pretty lofty, not unrealistic necessarily, but it's a pretty lofty yield goal of 22 tons. It is actually being reduced by the fact that soybeans were our previous crop. But you can also see that this is the only one that had a potassium recommendation. When you are establishing new crops that are perennial, like alfalfa, notice how much. This was a pretty reasonable soil test, like 9, I think, which is low, but not ridiculous. They really want, the recommendations are to go ahead and apply as much phosphorus at this time as you possibly can, because we want to get that level higher before we go ahead and establish something that is harder to penetrate. But down here in our crabgrass, if it's already established and we're not going to be incorporating it, that recommendation is going to be lower, even though that one was like a 5 part per million type test. So I mentioned on the publication that it shows crop removal rates, and also that same information is in the Excel document if you go to that tab. And so you can see here that in the crops where we are removing that material, we are pretty heavy users of some of these potassium levels, for example. If you can grow 5 tons of alfalfa, you are taking off a substantial amount, 300 pounds of, is that right? My math today, yes, I think that should be right. So 300 pounds of K2O. So that's a significant reduction because you're growing that high quality alfalfa. So that's why that recommendation was clear up there at 80. Native grass even does remove a pretty substantial amount of potassium, and that's why in a hay only situation, sometimes native grass can have some deficiency issues related to potassium. But you'll see that phosphorus is removed at relatively equal levels for a lot of our cool season things, and slightly less on most of our warm season things. The exception, I guess, here is Bermuda grass. It is a warm season, about the same as these. Does anybody have any questions about any of this so far? Okay, but this helps us know how much we need to apply. And again, 1 part per million is equal to 9 pounds of P2O5, and 1 part per million is equal to 18 pounds of K2O. So it's a lot. It's definitely a lot. All right. So common agricultural fertilizers, I just wanted to just shoot these up here for a brief second and to remind myself that I wanted to talk about, I have nitrogen misspelled severely, but nitrogen sources, how important timing and those kinds of things really are. Anhydrous ammonia is almost always going to be the least expensive option for nitrogen on a price per unit type of basis. But on an established forage, is just not going to work. If you can get it to seal and not lose the anhydrous, it can, but ultimately it's not. So now you're down to the dry fertilizers and the liquid fertilizers. And what can you tell me? Somebody tell me what the main difference, other than percent nitrogen, there is between urea and ammonium nitrate. Anybody have anything that they know right off the top of their head?
Urea can volatilize and lose some of it when you apply it.
Exactly. That is a big deal, and is especially a big deal when the temperatures are warm and when we have a light amount of moisture. So like less than like a trace amount of moisture, or even, like a quarter of an inch, something like that, of rainfall. Shortly after high temperatures and a small amount of moisture right after you apply urea is kind of the ideal situation to lose it to volatilization. So when we are fertilizing some of our warm season annuals, we may need to think about how we're doing so. Maybe you need to choose ammonium nitrate, which is likely going to be slightly more expensive on a price per unit basis, but maybe not, depending on your source and who you're using as your provider. Or you may have to overcome that by adding a slightly more urea than you might have otherwise. That's another common practice to be done, especially since ammonium nitrate is sometimes hard to find. I don't know if any of you have wanted to buy some and not had success in locating it before. We do have dealers in Pot County and some other places, but there are places in Kansas that ammonium nitrate just isn't available, period. And unfortunately, that's largely because of the Oklahoma City office building bombing, because this product was used for that, and so it's more closely monitored and regulated. But it is what it is. So sometimes urea, you have to kind of plan for that. And if you could get at least a ½ an inch of rain, you can get that incorporated. Or if you happen to have something that could subsurface, place it, but that's not likely, of course, on most of our forages. When we talk about liquid UAN, now we're talking about either 28% or 32% most of the time formulations, and they use different formulations largely because of the salting out temperature, how low does the temperature get kind of situation. The 32 can't handle the low temperatures quite as well, but they also are a combination of ammonium nitrate and urea and water. And so your 28% product is going to be slightly more urea on a percentage basis than is the 30, no, it's the other way around, sorry. The 32% is going to be slightly more urea on a percentage basis than ammonium nitrate or versus each other. So if you're trying to make a decision, keep that in mind. Not as high of a risk as a volatilization as, say, urea, but still right there. And if you don't have any, I mean, it's already liquid, so it is definitely available for volatilization if of the half portion or so that is urea based. Any questions about that? The other thing to keep in mind with nitrogen in particular is immobilization. And I think I will talk about that here in a little bit, but some of our, sometimes we have to feed the microbes that are in the soil when we have really high residue situations as well. Okay. Brome's response to nitrogen. So when I was getting my master's degree, my primary research was on soybeans and placement of potassium, actually, and corn too. But that was my primary thesis research. However, in order to graduate, we had to do a seminar, and I was asked by my major professor to put together the data from a bunch of different K-State studies, I guess 86 of them roughly, from the past, and try to figure out where and what benefit comes to adding more nitrogen, I guess is essentially what it is here. And so you can see in this chart, this one's a little bit different than the ones that the one that I made, but it's basically the exact same data, is that if you apply 30 pounds of nitrogen to brome, and you will see a yield increase here, 0.72 tons per acre, and you will see a return to additional nitrogen, considering that the hay is worth this and the nitrogen is worth this, of around $55.20. And then we'll keep adding these together. If you go to 60, you'll see that you also get an increase, slightly less, difference, but still there. Still making a cumulative increase. 90, which is kind of probably one of the levels that a lot of people consider stopping at. You're going to get this 4/10 here. You got an extra $12, so now you're at 89. You can, in ideal situations, go up to say 120, and you can see an increased yield, but you're only adding another $2.64. So you see that your return on adding that extra nitrogen goes down substantially as your rate of nitrogen goes up. And if you go clear up to 150, you actually go backwards. So that will lose you some money. So that's kind of one important thing to keep in mind. And that fluctuates as the price of nitrogen fluctuates. So when you talk to your dealer, it's a good idea to talk to them about how much a pound of nitrogen actual costs. So right now I think 56 might be a little bit higher than most of our sources, but somewhere in that range is usually between about 48 and 60 is going to be close to the price on most of the nitrogen sources. And more like 30, of course, if you get down into your anhydrous ammonia choices. And then the price per ton of hay, there's some years that there's so much hay that you can hardly give it away, but there's of course some years where the value is very high. So that can help you determine how much you're willing to fertilize based off of that. and your expected production. This is just more evidence for that, the higher the fertilizer rates, the higher the yields. But you'll see that here in 2011, which was probably a slightly dry year, 12 and 13 were, I think, but you'll see that it flattened off much faster. So when they don't have moisture, adding more nitrogen doesn't help, I guess, is really what it comes down to. Tall fescue, another cool season crop, going to respond very similarly. To notice that my range here is 0 to 100, not as quite as high. So we're still gaining at a pretty significant rate up to about this 90 pounds per acre. And this is the same data because, you know, it's always good to make sure that the data that you're putting out is appropriate in your area, as well as it can be replicated in other places. So this is Iowa State doing work with tall fescue. This is from our Brome publication about utilization and production. And it talks about a little bit about the fertility, that's not the word I'm looking for, the forage quality aspects. The most important thing that fertilizer does in terms of fertility is going to be crude protein. There are other things too, digestibility, those kinds of things, phosphorus levels to a certain extent. But crude protein is going to be, I guess, what we'll call number one. Remember, we're dealing with a cool season crop. So this would probably be the timing that we would most commonly focus on. And you'll see here that if you apply 120 or so, you know, your productivity is good. This is a difference between nitrate and urea at the same use rates. Again, you can kind of compromise that, but or you can adjust that. And your crude protein is going to be somewhere around 9 or so. If you go up, it can go up to say 12 even at that time frame. If you wait till later, you can get some increases in crude protein, but your total production probably isn't going to be as high. You'll see that the 120 here is at least as high, and the urea started to kind of perform well here. I'm not quite sure why that might be. But again, if you're going to do a fall grazing type of situation, maybe you need to look at this August application as well. And you can see that if you don't apply any fertilizer in August, you're going to see a pretty substantial decrease in productivity, as well as the crude protein is going to be low, 6, 7, something like that. But if you do go ahead and fertilize it with at least a little bit, you're going to be closer to that 8 or 9. So that's kind of an important aspect to keep in mind as well. That split application, if you are trying to graze a cool season grass, is an important characteristic. So you may be wondering, I know nitrogen and I know crude protein, and those are things that I'm familiar with and I've always been concerned with. But what about the other two, the other big two, phosphorus and potassium? So I wanted to throw in a slide here on, I'm getting late. I'm going to have to hurry up a little bit. I wanted to throw in a slide about what does phosphorus do in the first place. So phosphorus is important for photosynthesis, thank you, and root growth, and it's essential for carbohydrate. So root growth and development are really important things that phosphorus does, and phosphorus is essentially crucial during the establishment phase because of all of these factors. So if you're trying to plant new brome or new anything, getting your phosphorus levels right based on soil test is an important aspect of accomplishing that. And so then here's some information about response to phosphorus. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail other than to say that a lot of times maximum brome profits can occur somewhere around 25 pounds of phosphorus if phosphorus is needed. And that's an important aspect that a soil test will tell you. And you'll see that when you do have low phosphorus, you'll get a significant response to even a small amount of phosphorus application. So in this low phosphorus field, you know, your yield was fairly low, but it almost doubled, or basically doubled, when you added 15 pounds of phosphorus. And you can see it goes up even more later. Potassium, I have a lot of information here, but the most important thing to say about potassium is potassium helps a forage plant or any plant withstand stress. So if you want your stand to remain strong and healthy and deal with disease and insects and drought and those kinds of things, you need to have your potassium levels right. And remember that forages, especially those that we are completely removing from their location and moving to another site, are very heavy users of potassium because the seed itself removes a fairly small amount. Oh, go back. So this is from the tall fescue document, but I do think it's kind of interesting. This is research from Kilgore, who was the area agronomist in Southeast area for many, many years. And you'll see that at the same nitrogen rates, what happens when you add some phosphorus, what happens when you add some potassium, and then what happens if you just reduce your nitrogen rates. You're still going to have more than what you had with 100 pounds of nitrogen. So that's something to keep in mind when you have a soil test that tells you that you need phosphorus and potassium. It's very important to go ahead and apply that. Again, I'm running late, so I'm going to go a little bit quickly here. Sulfur is the nutrient that we have not been too terribly concerned about in the past, but this is the reason why we're concerned about it now. Our Clean Air Acts are excellent for having cleaner air, but they, before then, if we had a coal-fired plant making electricity in Pot County, essentially we never had to worry that sulfur was coming into our fields through the air and being deposited back into our fields. Now we're in a situation where we have to pay for it, essentially. And anything that is a forage crop, in particular a hay crop, again, we're removing that entirely. And so the weather conditions are out there, and there's essentially no application from manure or other fertilizers other than sulfur-based fertilizers. So, and this is kind of a response thing. Ultimately, 20 pounds of sulfur is more than enough, or about right. You'll see 0 had lower yields, 15 a little higher, not any response to go up to 30, I guess is the way to say that. These are our sources of sulfur. Elemental sulfur or gypsum are probably some of the most commonly used ones, but you can use ATS and AMS also to get those sulfur. Little bit about tallgrass prairie, hay meadow management, the maximum amount of fertilizer that you want to apply to this, and it does not necessarily have to be based on soil test, but it's not a horrible idea to do so. Just to make sure that you're not really very high or something, especially in potassium, but or phosphorus. 30 10, 30 is kind of the general recommendation. And it will never be higher than that if you are haying tallgrass prairie. Broom sedge bluestem is the weed that I wanted to talk about. I'm going to be brief, but my slides kind of have some more detail about it. But it is commonly known as poverty grass, and it is a short-lived perennial that is completely unpalatable. It has allelopathic chemicals. In other words, it fights off the establishment and survival of other grasses near it. It makes a big challenge for establishing clover, and it is totally, almost entirely related to soil fertility. So, and that's why they call it poverty grass. It looks a little bit like little bluestem if you aren't paying attention, but in a brome field or a fescue field in particular, if you see something that looks like little blue, it probably isn't. It's probably broom sedge bluestem. It does have that kind of fuzzy look to it, but it is much sturdier and probably more fuzzy than little blue. But these are some of the characteristics to it. And this time of year, or especially in the fall, it stands out pretty significantly because it has an orange to bronze color, especially in something that's like a cool season grasses. We are also seeing this kind of invade some native grasses sometimes, and that it makes it more challenging, but we'll kind of go on from here. Oops, I went the wrong way. Nope, wrong way. All right, so the reason that it happens is lower fertility and being overgrazed. And the number one thing that you're low on when you see broom sedge bluestem is phosphorus. Almost guaranteed that that's going to be the case. So if you soil test a place that you see broom sedge bluestem, it's going to be a low P soil. It also tolerates low pH, so that may become a problem in some cases too. Sometimes lime can help deal with it. And again, I already said, very low quality, not palatable at all. They will never select it if you're grazing it, etc. Okay, mowing doesn't work. They did find out that late burning can work, but the number one way to do it is fertilize it. And you may think that's crazy, but if you have a brome field that has broom sedge bluestem in it, you should not spray it. You should not do anything else. You should fertilize it. So that's with phosphorus fertilizer based on a soil test that you might do. This doesn't really say anything new, and I think it went the wrong way anyway. And this doesn't say a whole lot of new either, other than to say that lime and phosphorus are both somewhat involved in the problem. And this is an example of a situation where no phosphorus has been applied and the soil test level is phosphorus is 3 parts per million. Again, we would rather it be closer to 20. And then this is where 100 pounds of phosphorus per acre per year for 3 years was applied, basically on the same field. And that managed to get us up to 30 parts per million, very little broom sedge bluestem in this field. So again, fertilizer is the way that you accomplish basically outcompeting it. It outcompetes your brome or fescue or grass if there's no phosphorus, because it is adapted to surviving in a low phosphorus situation. Yep, okay, that's good. And I don't need to read these either, so in an effort of time. And then just briefly, nitrate toxicity, prussic acid poisoning, and even grass tetany to some cases are related to soil fertility. Particularly nitrate toxicity is something that we concern ourselves with when we have high nitrogen, and especially in certain species. So anything that's in the sorghum species that has had high nitrogen or even medium nitrogen application rates, especially if they're late in the season and has experienced drought, is likely to have some nitrate problems. So keeping the nitrate or the nitrogen applications within reasons of your yield goal is important, and considering what the weather conditions are like is also very important to try to limit nitrate toxicity. And then prussic acid loves high nitrogen and low phosphorus and potassium. Although you can hay or ensile a high concentration of cyanide, which is what it is, and reduce the levels of prussic acid in a field, or in a forage sample. So again, I went longer than I ideally wanted to, but I am here until I have answered some of your questions. I may not have covered enough detail on some of your interests, for example, cover crops, but I did mention, that if you graze those cover crops, you may not need to add a lot more fertilizer. And maybe if you're fertilizing the crop before it, and then you're going to plant some cover crops, you can just apply a little bit additional fertilizer when you're fertilizing the previous crop, and have enough there for the cycling situation that's available there. So grazing is a really strong management tactic in dealing with nutrient management and forages.